Welcome, everybody. We'll give everybody a little bit of time to log in, and we'll get started here in about 12:02. Like folks are logging in. I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the Frontiers Research and Discovery Grand Rounds November session. We're excited to have a great talk related to translational research versus translational science. Before we dive in, I do want to kind of pause and do a little bit of housekeeping here. Remind everybody that we've got some phenomenal resources on the Frontiers ctsi.org website. So please log in, take a look, see how we can help and collaborate with you. Register to be a member of that. That gives you great opportunity to continue to leverage those resources, including the Research and Discovery Grand Round sessions. Also want to have everybody save the date for our last Research and Discovery Grand Rounds for the 2024 year. We'll wrap up on December 12th from noon to 1, where we'll have Emily Hurley, Assistant Professor in Division of Health Outcomes Research at Children's Mercy, talk about formative research and applications for health interventions, so very excited to have that talk. So look forward to seeing you guys there in December. With that, I am excited to introduce our speakers today. Like I said, they're going to be discussing translational research versus translational science and all that entails. We've got Robin Liston, Project Director in Frontiers, who helps oversee and supports all of the funding programs. And I'm sure many of you guys have worked with her. She'll be joined by Lisa Sanderson-Cox, Professor of Population Health at the University of Kansas Medical Center. She's also the Associate Director in Frontiers. Wearing both of those hats, she definitely is heavily involved in community-engaged research, focusing on health equity, advancing smoking cessation in underserved populations, works with community and collaboration and special populations within Frontiers. So great perspective, excited to have them. So welcome, Robin. I'll go ahead and let you take over the screen.
Almost there. So my internet is shaky, even though I'm in my office. So I'm going to turn my camera off while I'm talking in hopes that that can help. Okay, so we are excited to be here. Thank you for the introduction, Jamie. As you can see, we are wanting to share what the difference is between translational science versus translational research. I'm going to start with some of our funding program key dates. And the rationale for that is because we are transitioning to require a translational science focus in those applications. We will be here to help everyone, but that is one of the rationales for this presentation today. I will briefly describe the vision and charge of NCATS, which is our funder. I will walk through the translational science continuum, and then I will be passing the virtual stage to Dr. Cox so that she can really explain how or describe what that looks like in our funded programs. I will say that Jamie and Ashley will be assisting monitoring the chat. So if you, as well as hand raised, if you do have questions throughout, you are welcome to pause or let us know during, and we can pause and take those questions. There will be time at the end as well. So we do have 4 major funding programs, and I won't read all of these key dates on these slides, but just wanted to remind everybody that it is tomorrow that our Lauren S. Aronson pilot letters of intent are due. Hopefully that you have been seeing the communications that have gone out about those. And then we'll let letters of intent applicants know we will notify them the week of December 16th. Oops, I skipped one. So we also have an Institute for Advancing Medical Innovation Trailblazer. That RFA will be released on December 4th with application deadlines in early March. Wow, 2025 is almost here already. Our Biostats Epidemiology Research Design Trailblazer, that will be released the following week. So on December 11th with an application deadline also in early March. And then finally, our Integrating Special Populations pilot RFA will be released on January 6th. I've been clicking through these pretty quickly, but I have, you can see the webpage on the Frontiers overall webpage. Get Funding is a tab at the top, so you can find all of these details on that website. Okay, so National Center for Advancing Translational Science, or NCATS, as I said earlier, their overall vision is more treatments for all people more quickly. So institutes like Frontiers, there's 63 of us now. Generally, we say about 60. That's our charge, is to work through making treatments for all people more quickly. It is disease agnostic. So many of you know, and I won't go in deeply into Frontiers, but we are disease agnostic infrastructure. You know, we want to help determine where pitfalls exist in that translational research, translational science process. We want to make things more efficient, more effective, so that population health can improve more quickly. This is an image that I have to get credit to Stanford for, but again, many of you are familiar with this translational science continuum. So starting back at just basic science to translation to the community. So it's, you know, working through improving efficiencies, determining pitfalls, determining what works throughout this translational science continuum. There we go. Okay, so translational research. I am going to read this, even though I know you can all read, but it is designed as an endeavor to traverse a particular step in that continuum that we were just looking at of the translational process for a particular target or disease. And again, we're going to go into examples, but this is what most researchers this is what they do, right? Depending on if they're, you know, if they're looking at diabetes or chronic kidney disease, research is looking at a specific target or disease. But NCATS conducts and supports research in the science of translation to discover the scientific, and this is bold for a reason, will be the meat of our discussion, but to discover the scientific and operational principles for improvements in translational efficiency. So translational science, again, is the field of investigation focused on understanding these principles that underlying each step of the translational process. So these are things that apply to any target or disease. understanding these common causes of inefficiency and failure in translational research projects. So that's the main goal. These translational research and translational science, how Frontiers is looking at this, they are connected. A translational research project will then just speak to the translational science component of that, or the translational science principles. The badges, as we call them. And I will pass the stage to you, Dr. Cox.
Thank you so much, Robin. So I want to have everyone pause and look at this for just a minute. This is a depiction of principles of translational science as defined by NCATS. And it's a useful approach to helping us think about what are the underlying core elements that we really need to be thinking about when we're thinking about not only just moving down that translational research continuum, but thinking about the kind of the bigger picture, not only how to take one step at a time, as Robin was saying with translational research, but really how to think about overcoming barriers broadly. And this is where this conceptualization of these badges or the translational science principles are helpful. So what we're going to do for the next few minutes is we're going to walk through each one of these principles of translational science to help us think more carefully about what we really mean when we're wanting people to help us advance translational science, help us understand the science of translational research. And so we want to emphasize that this is the beginning of a slightly different way of thinking about some of our work. We want to encourage everyone, including individuals who may be applying for some of our Frontiers Pilot Awards, to think about how does their research have impact, but how does their research also speak to the broader perspective of advancing science? We're going to ask each pilot proposal investigator to articulate how their proposed research speaks to one or more of these principles. And so we thought that a great way to think about them more broadly is to give you examples from existing Frontiers supported pilots. So we'll walk through each of these principles. We'll also give examples of how some of the ongoing and previously supported work represents some of these principles. So let's go ahead and walk through them one at a time. The first one that we're going to talk about is considering how our work addresses unmet needs. So one of the priorities is to focus on pursuing scientific goals that address unmet scientific needs, patient or population health needs. And so examples might be, how does work contribute to advancing under-investigated areas of science or of questions that present unique research challenges, identifying those challenges, and then hopefully identifying solutions to address those challenges. In terms of patient and population health needs, we're looking at advancing research to develop solutions for unmet patient or population health needs, and you'll see that might include barriers that we even see in terms of clinical care all the way to community application and implementation. Let's give an example for this. So here we have an example looking at the work of Jenny Robinson, and a particular study that she brought to Frontiers was deciphering sex differences in adolescent knee meniscal injury and regeneration. Okay, that's a very specific research question. How does this fit in here? Well, One thing that you'll see in this knowledge gap, she identified this unmet need. She identified that tears were happening more often in females than males. And so she developed aims to not only identify sex-based differences, but she also was looking to develop and validate a testing system to identify how to support controlled dosing of estrogen to meniscal cells. So in this example, she's identifying an unmet need, and her approach is speaking specifically to her research question, but is also providing information that could be used more broadly. And her work also touches on another principle of translational science. We're going to move on to the next badge, which is talking about cross-disciplinary team science. So first, let's talk about what we mean by cross-disciplinary team science, and then we can come back again to Jennifer's work as an example. So within cross-disciplinary team science, we're talking about engaging team members with expertise across disciplines, across fields, and different professions who can come together to produce research that advances translation along that translational research continuum. Things that couldn't be achieved individually, but really requires this sort of team approach. And how does that work? Well, we can leverage broad expertise. So by engaging colleagues from across disciplines, we can advance research along that continuum because we're able to integrate knowledge. We can integrate theories or designs and approaches, methodologies or technologies across different disciplines, bringing them together to approach problems in a novel way. We can integrate this information. We can produce more holistic research designs and findings that are maybe more relevant to real-world application. And we can even look at things like the organizational environment. So how can we set up an environment that enables team science through leadership and management, through policies and reward systems? And many of these examples are, if you're thinking, how could I do that within my own work? How could I really do a more effective approach using team science and maybe even developing questions that contribute to advancing team science? Frontiers has great resources. By contacting Frontiers, we have folks who can help you articulate some of those goals and think about maybe approaches that would help you do that. Let's look at Jenny Robinson's project again. So we talked about the aims of her project, but this is a great example of collaboration because she was able to bring together orthopedics and genomics folks to better understand these sex differences in tissue injuries. So here's a great example of engaging colleagues from across disciplines. Here's a great example of bringing together concepts from different areas and sharing methods or technologies, and again, to produce a more holistic approach with this research design. So that's a great example. Let's move on to our next principle, which is thinking about generalizable solutions. Now, for many of us in our work, we're thinking about, okay, with my specific research question, how generalizable are my findings going to be? Well, within a translational science, thinking about generalizable solutions, we really want to think about big picture, right? Beyond our specific topic, maybe. Maybe some of our approaches can really look at generalizable solutions beyond our formerly narrow focus. So here's an example. We're talking about generalizable solutions in terms of translational science. We're looking at developing innovations that address persistent challenges to advancing translational processes that are found across multiple research initiatives or projects. We can think about advancing research by identifying or developing or testing solutions to common roadblocks. What are the barriers that we've run into in the past? and how can we overcome some of those in ways that would serve our future research, but also others. These also are not talking about necessarily disease specific, even if the application in one person's pilot research might be for a specific patient population, a specific disease group, or a specific setting. Are the questions that they're asking going to inform us about solutions that may benefit others as well? So approach research challenges and develop solutions that seek commonalities across a range of diseases or conditions. And then thinking again about organizational environments, developing solutions through policies, through shared resources, thinking about solutions on that organizational level. So let's think about an example of this from past awardees. So if we look at Stacy Farr and Dan Nodian's work on implementation feasibility of a patient decision aid in chronic coronary disease, in this particular project, they're developing process maps of diagnostic and treatment pathways for shared decision making. They're defining technical workflows of producing evidence-based PDAs, and they're looking at assessing patient and provider implementation barriers and facilitators. And this is talking about generalizability because their patient decision aid personalized to a patient's risk factors aligns with their values and preferences and can empower patient communication with their providers. But even though they're focusing specifically on chronic coronary disease, someone else could look at their research methodology, their approach, and possibly even some of their findings and solutions, and might be able to apply some of those solutions to other areas. So in this way, they're able to facilitate advancement of science, advancement of that translational aspect. Okay, we're going to move on to the next translational science principle, which is creativity and innovation. Now, maybe we've been thinking about this within our own work, within our own collaborations in a certain way, and we're just challenging you to think a little bit more broadly. So when we're talking about creativity and innovation as a key principle of translational science, we're talking about leveraging creativity and innovation in research design, in facilitating factors with the goal of increasing the impact of the research. So let's think about research design and implementation. We're talking about posing innovative research questions and developing and implementing innovations in methodology and technology or approaches that increase the impact of the research. So, for instance, thinking about how do we generalize this work, as we've talked about in the previous example, to advancing research across multiple initiatives, multiple diseases, other conditions, in an innovative way that perhaps we haven't thought about before. How can we think not only about the impact of our work, but using innovative approaches to think about our approach and our findings beyond what we've considered in the past. And if we look at research processes and structures, we may be looking at developing and implementing innovations in research teams and interactions, leadership management, partnerships, operations, and other support that will enhance the quality and impact of our research. So when we're thinking about creativity and innovation, it's not always just about our measurement, or it's not always just about our analytical design. We can think about creativity and innovation in some of those partnerships that we're building and the way that we're working with our partners. As you can tell, these principles connect to each other as well. Let's look at an example from Dr. Michelle Redman. So in a pilot project, we're talking about exploring life course and everyday stressors in the lives of pregnant and postpartum women and the role of music therapy as an intervention tool, Dr. Redman brings this innovative research question, determining how music can help alleviate stress during pregnancy. And here's an example of leveraging that creativity and innovation with the goal of increasing the impact of this research. Yes, she's identifying a need. Yes, she is using this creativity and innovation that we're talking about. She is maybe approaching a very specific research question, but the way that she's approaching is speaking to science more broadly. Okay, our next translational science principle that we'll talk about is thinking about efficiency and speed, right? If one of our goals is to advance this whole translational process, we're naturally thinking about efficiency and speed of translation, right? So if we're trying to move from T1 to T2 and T2 to T3, and eventually moving amazing findings that are going to impact the health of the community and finally getting that science out to advance the health of the community, how can we do that in a way that does not take decades and decades? And if we're looking even with our own smaller research projects, what are we doing to try to help advance and enhance the efficiency and speed of translational research? So one example is thinking about scientific efficiencies, developing and implementing innovations in scientific approaches and methods and technologies that accelerate the pace of translational research. Looking at collaboration is one really key element. So how can we implement evidence-informed practices to enhance the speed at which collaborations and teams form? How we develop a shared vision and goal, how we can more effectively communicate, how we can coordinate work tasks and share data. All of these pieces, when we have a broken system, or maybe when we have a system that has not yet been well developed, can slow the speed of translational science. So what can we do to enhance this instead? Project management can be a big piece in this as well. So implementing milestone-based decision-making to enable rapid agreement, to enable resources to be used efficiently. And again, within Frontiers, we have resources and expertise that can help enhance this or these elements within the research that you're working on. And so we encourage people to think about how the resources within Frontiers could be helpful in this. Okay, let's look at an example from Courtney Barrios. So she had a project moving from diagnosis to improved outcomes, engaging community members to identify and address barriers in rural translational genomic research in medicine. And she has the aims of her project. And what's really important is she's developing innovative solutions to determine barriers for rural families to accessing testing and developing solutions to overcome those particular barriers to then facilitate faster care. So there's really direct impact of this type of research question because it is identifying those barriers, figuring out solutions, and getting patients and care and access to important elements of care more quickly. So this is where I challenge all of us in our own work to think about how can we identify barriers that are getting in the way of this speed and efficiency. Okay, this relates, all of these, I think, principles can relate to each other in different ways, but we're gonna come back to Courtney's project as an example of our next translational science principle. So our next translational science principle is looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And we're talking about leveraging diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility to produce research outcomes that are relevant to the full diversity of the population. So we're thinking about not only how can we advance science, but how can we make sure that the solutions that we are finding are actually reaching all the diversity of our population. So some examples are looking at research priority settings. Are we including diverse perspectives in research priorities? Are we thinking about partnerships with diverse collaborators? Are we looking at how our research investments represent diverse populations and are attending to patient health needs from a diverse population? When we're thinking about our scientific approaches, are we integrating diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility into the development of our research questions, of our research resources and designs? Are we using diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility when we're thinking about how we're implementing our studies, when we're thinking about the full translational research continuum? This particular principle really can be at a piece that everyone includes across the whole spectrum. And when we think about workforce and operations, we can be thinking about advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility to the scientific workforce to leverage maximum expertise. We can implement best practices in outreach, in our recruitment and hiring, in our team development, and our research idea development. And we can do all of these things to help sustain a diverse and talented workforce. And again, Frontiers offers resources and expertise to help you build this into the work that you are developing and the work that you're doing every day. So I encourage everyone to think about how they can access those and integrate those resources into their own work. Let's go back to Courtney's study again, because in her efforts to address her research question, she really looked at excluded and underrepresented populations and focusing on genetic testing and counseling, which not everyone has access to. And so she identified specifically rural communities as being a high need area, which is, we think, again, about our very first principle of unmet needs. Here, in thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, she actually engaged individuals from the community, both from the patient side and from the provider side, to help identify what these barriers are. So those voices of the community are really important in strengthening this whole research approach and really helping create a research question and a solution that is something beyond what one investigator ever could have done on their own. So great example here. So our last translational science principle is thinking about using bold and rigorous research approaches. So we want to think about developing ambitious research questions and addressing them with rigorous and robust methodology that will help generate reproducible findings and contribute to advancing translational science. So, for example, bold scientific approaches, thinking about research goals that have the potential to produce major advances or even entire paradigm shifts. These might be in areas of research that have been historically intractable or where there have been high risks of failure. In terms of rigor and reproducibility, we may employ rigorous and robust approaches to generate reproducible findings and thinking about findable, accessible, reusable data that will enable the research to advance translational progress, regardless of whether the initial research objective is met. So this is an important area to think about. Individuals who are thinking about their pilot awards and developing their research questions is, while you may have an expectation of you may have a hypothesis of what you might be seeing in your particular research. You want to also be thinking, even if the outcomes are not what you expect, is the approach in your research actually something that is going to still be meaningful?
I think Lisa's frozen.
Next steps in research. So we encourage people to think about this a little bit differently. And let's talk about an example from a bird awardee. Dr. Bantis did a project on combinations and cutoff estimations for non-monotone markers. And in this particular study, the specific question is looking at optimized cutoffs, developing a framework for estimating optimized cutoffs, and combining biomarkers to increase accuracy, specifically developing biostatistical methods for combining the top performing biomarkers. So in terms of a bold and rigorous scientific approach, we're looking at method development that will determine cutoff points for disease classification using biomarkers and establishing what's optimal for decision making, informative for physicians and researchers to develop interventions and treatments. And while Dr. Bantis's project had a specific focus, the approach, the methodology of this could be used by others. So again, we're talking about not only bold and rigorous approach, but we're talking about the generalizability of this type of approach and how it can advance translational science more broadly. Okay, we're getting towards the end, and all of these examples you have seen have not been individuals producing research on their own, right? All of these are really individuals who are working in some type of partnership. And we've talked about team science, but when we're talking about boundary crossing partnerships, we're talking about leveraging collaborations across agencies or sectors, or engaging patients and communities in research to advance translational progress. So for example, it may be looking at cross-sectional partnerships across departments, across universities, and Frontiers is a fantastic infrastructure if you're interested in looking beyond your usual set of collaborators and seeing what you could do if you were able to find other expertise at other partner institutions, just as an example. Also looking at patient and community engagement, as we've discussed, but involving patients and communities as research collaborators from design to approach to implementation and even to dissemination. From an organizational perspective, we also could be thinking about how can we develop systems that incentivize crossing those boundaries or creating those partnerships, or building in policies, even reward systems that help us more easily cross those boundaries and partner to advance research. So let's look at our last example, and we're going to look at a project by Dr. Vivian. The specific project is looking at cell-based platform for screening for therapeutics for Vici syndrome and other diseases. And in this particular example, this is a cross-sectorial partnership. So the rare disease community, bringing in experts from different disciplines, genomics, disease model development, drug discovery, bioinformatics, clinical pharmacology, and lifespan research. So bringing together all these different partners to address this very specific question. And this is an excellent example of how engaging these various sectors and engaging the patient community voices themselves can really lead to, as we're talking about, some really bold, innovative research. Now, one of the things that we want to do with this particular example is that a project really can speak to multiple translational science principles. Okay. So every project doesn't have to clearly speak to every translational science principle. But this is an example of a project that examining it more specifically, not just the specific aims, but thinking about how those aims were developed, thinking about the research design and methodology, thinking about the interdisciplinary team and the use of community to inform the project, really together can speak to multiple principles of translational science. And this is where we encourage people to start thinking about their own work, take a step back and think about how their own work really fits, not just in terms of translational research, not just in terms of, as our colleagues at the University of Michigan were saying, using the auto industry analogy, they were saying not just in terms of how can you move the science down the assembly line, how can you not just focus on eventually developing a car and getting that car out into the community, but how can you actually enhance the entire process of the assembly line? How can you make it more efficient? How can you use bold technology? And so that sort of step back. So again, when we're talking about step back to the very beginning when Robin Liston was talking about the different pilot awards within Frontiers, we want applicants to be thinking about translational science and how their proposals speak to these important principles of translational science. So let's pause where we are right now and talk about questions from the group. I encourage questions from anyone. You can enter them in the chat, or you could just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. We see here the funding website for Frontiers, and we always encourage people to come to us at Frontiers to help you think about research questions and getting access to the different resources that we have available at Frontiers. But questions from the group? And feel free to unmute yourself if you're in a setting that you're able, because we'd love to engage in conversation.
I have a question.
Yes.
I also put it in the chat. My question is, can you elaborate a little bit on the differences between like translational research or science and implementation science? We just had a conversation yesterday about this. And after this conversation, I feel like I'm still not very, because many of the things you mentioned is also what implementation science does, right? So
yes.
Yes.
And I think that's a great question. And if I'm going to be very frank, I think that you could take these different principles in general and and think about them in terms of science or research, period, right? So when, for instance, I have a background doing clinical trials, identifying different approaches to advancing treatment to address health equity by bringing established treatments to underserved populations. I can focus on just my research question on how can I advance this particular type of treatment. And I can be thinking to myself, oh, I want to have a creative approach. I want to be focusing on unmet needs. Yes. I want to look at the generalizability of my specific findings. And I happen to do multidisciplinary team science. That's great. And when I've thought in the past, I've thought, okay, this is part of translational research because I'm trying to take something that's been identified as an effective treatment and I'm trying to move it to population that hasn't had access in the past. So, okay, that's translational research in some ways. In the bigger picture of translational science, so your work might be translational research, and it might be implementation science, which I think is really, really critical to the concept of translational research, because you really are saying, how can we take evidence-based findings and move them out into a larger setting or a larger community, or implement them in a particular clinical setting, or implement them in a bigger community system. And those implementation science questions of how can we do that the most efficiently? How can we do that in an innovative way? How can we do that in a way that takes less time for clinicians or reaches more patients, right? Those are all critical questions of implementation science. And I think those are exactly the types of questions and approaches that, yes, are true for translational research. And your translational research question might be very specific. How can I get tobacco use treatment into primary care settings? And is it more effective to have a management system in one hub that reaches out to multiple rural health providers? Or is it better to use telehealth? Or how are these different approaches? So that's all true. And it has kind of a specific focus. I think in translational science, we have to pause for a minute and say, yeah, I did this implementation research, but how could I share my findings in a way that may also, or how can I speak to some of my innovative approaches, or speak to some of my innovative findings in a way that would not just speak to the individuals involved in my particular project. So maybe it's not just my underserved population that I've worked with, but also other underserved populations. Maybe it's not just this really cool implementation approach within rural primary healthcare settings, but maybe that approach could also be used with some other type of network of clinics, for instance. So I think that implementation science is the framework is exactly central to translational research and to translational science. I think that translational science is really taking a step back and looking at it a little bit more broadly, for example. So if I can expand on that even more, I hope I'm making sense. But let's say somebody was proposing a research project for one of the Frontiers pilots. And it's an implementation science project with a specific setting and a specific, a relatively specific clinical question. When they're talking about how this contributes to translational science, it may be thinking about some of these principles in just a little bit more broad perspective. And that's great, because it challenges us to think about not just what's the immediate impact of our work, but kind of what's the slightly more broad impact of our work. And so, for instance, if I've done some very effective approaches to advanced tobacco treatment with Black smokers, which is one of the things I do, could I be using some of the approaches? Could I be using some of the findings? Could I be thinking about how I've done some of the methodology when I want to then maybe work on a different disease focus, but within that same community? Or when I'm taking some of the same approaches and saying, well, how could I better improve tobacco treatment within the Latino community, for instance? And so it's taking that extra step back and thinking about those broader applications is one way that I think of it. Robin has some really good ideas in this general area as well. And I don't know if you could add to that question, Robin.
I think you answered that one very well, actually.
Alice, does that help you in terms of, it's not just specific, it's just sort of like, okay, yeah, I've thought about it one way for so long. If I take a step back, can I have sort of a greater appreciation of how my maybe more narrow focus also pertains to a little bit more broad focus? Does that make sense at all?
Yes. So first, thank you so much for answering my question. I think it helps a little bit, but I still feel like I struggle a little bit with it. So is it okay to think that when we're looking at translational translational research, we're looking at those different T1, T0, T1, T2, like there are different stages, but with implementation science, I think it's like you definitely have something that you already proven it to be working, and you just want to make sure that more people are using it. So is it more like it's applied at a different stage of the research? Am I right or am I not?
I know we
Totally
have more
off.
implementation scientists on the in the presentation here, and I welcome anyone in the audience who wants to add to this conversation, because for Robin and I and the other folks at Frontiers who've been discussing this concept of translational science principles, and NCAT's emphasis on translational science, it's interesting because there are slightly different takes on that. And so there's slightly different interpretations. But in terms of implementation science, I'm curious if anyone else on the call would like to unmute themselves and share in this discussion. I see a comment. If you're in a spot and you're able to unmute, please feel free. Otherwise, we'll try to read the comments.
Hi, Lisa and Robin, and this is May.
Hi,
May
May.
hi, from UMKC. Actually, I think Alice's question is really, like, I have been buffering for a long time. But recently I did have great conversations with the NCI people about implementation science. So from my understanding is like implementation science is like you already did your clinical trials, you know, you already showed this is right, this is good, you know, and also you already showed it works with different populations. But now you are going to implement this as a real, like a clinical change, change clinical practice. However, recently they also have a different thoughts about implementation research. So now they have a hybrid 1, hybrid 2, hybrid 3 designs, and which is almost similar to the translational research, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. But I think the only thing they excluded is basically the basic science. But for me, I think translational science is like, even if when you're doing the basic science, how are you thinking about the principles of a translational science to make your research question and your research more translatable later on, and you can go through the trajectory. But then implementation science is already, you establish your evidence, and now you're going to really implement in a real world. So that's my understanding after months of the talks with the people.
May, that's really helpful, and I like how you're bringing in your experience and your discussions to kind of clarify some of that. So would you say, in terms of implementation science, you wouldn't be talking about sort of T0 to T1, T1 to T2?
No.
But translational science really offers this umbrella across the whole spectrum and moving things. So there may be barriers within implementation science, and addressing those barriers and identifying solutions would not only serve translational or would not only serve implementation science, but it would also speak to translational science more broadly. Whereas there also might be barriers from moving from T1 to T2. What are some of those barriers? How can we overcome those barriers? The example project might be a very specific focus. But what we learn from that project may be able to speak more broadly to translational science and how to overcome, how to, increase the pace of moving things along the assembly line in some ways.
I like how you said, Alisa. I think what is the difference is like for implementation design, right? So if you have a hybrid one, is you're really looking at, okay, this intervention is already proved works. However, I'm not sure whether this intervention will work for this real world. So I'm put more emphasis on testing the effectiveness in the real world. And then I also looking at implementation barriers, like what you said, similar to the translation like barriers. What is the workflow? What is how many resources we need to have in order to implement? And then you have a hybrid too, which is really focused on the barriers of the implementing, but very small amount of like maybe just collect the data to see if the effectiveness is good. But then you have a hybrid 3 really focus on effectiveness of the implementation. So I think for me, I feel like a translational trajectory is like along the way, you already resolved a lot of barriers, and also you address a lot of paths you need to implement them, So basically, if you haven't addressed it along your way to develop an intervention, you might be able to address in the implementation science in the hybrid 1 design. So that's how I see. So I feel if I can see it a little bit clearly, might be my understanding is like a translational science is a trajectory until we can really implement it to a real world. So implementation science will be how are we going to implement this into the real world? And then so in a lot of ways, if we do hybrid 1 or hybrid 2, there's a lot of translational barriers. Like how are we going to get solution barriers probably will also be resolved in the hybrid 1 and hybrid 2 design.
Thank you for sharing that. I really think that adds to the discussion. I know
So,
we're coming to
one
the
more question, just confirm with you. And seems like this hybrid design maybe could be something that if we don't have the clinical trial evidence, then we can work on that in the same time. The hybrid format allow us to address the implementation issues. Now, my question is that the current frontier, those pilot study, are you guys were not taking any hybrid design, or you just focus on the translational science focus? In other words, it has to be focused on the translational science, but not really hybrid design. So that's my question.
Robin, I don't know if you have a specific answer to that question. My initial thought is that it's not design specific. What we're looking for isn't necessarily design specific, but it's more in the proposal, can you also include some discussion of the translational science aspects of your work? Would you say that, Robin?
Yes, I would agree.
And more of that can be found online at the actual at the Frontiers website, looking at the specific RFAs for the pilots. And then any of our Frontier staff would be happy to help work more specifically with addressing that. I am appreciative of the fact that we have a lot we could continue to talk about, but we are at the end of the hour. I wanted to just thank everyone for being part of this discussion. I hope that we can continue this discussion, and I hope that you'll feel free to contact us at Frontiers in thinking about how we can help you conceptualize the work that you're doing, and how we can continue to move science forward. Any final comments, Robin?
No, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you to our presenters. We appreciate it. And thank you for everybody. Have a good rest of the day, and look forward to seeing you next month at our December session.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Lisa and
you.
Robin. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.